Matthias Brenner watched from inside his hay bale walls as Wilhelm Schäfer pounded on the door, frost covering the man's beard, his lips blue, begging to be let into the cabin everyone had called a death trap just 6 months earlier. Outside, the blizzard of 1869 had turned the Dakota Territory into a white hell, where temperatures had dropped to 40 below zero, and every log cabin within 15 miles was losing the battle to keep its occupants alive. Before we see how a structure built from animal feed became the difference between life and death, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button. The Dakota Territory in 1868 was not kind to men who did things differently. Matthias Brenner had learned this truth over his 5 winters, trapping along the James River, where the prairie met scattered timber groves and the wind carried warnings of the open plains beyond. He was competent enough. His trap lines produced decent beaver and muskrat harvests. His shooting was reliable. His camp management was methodical, but trappers who worked the same region noticed something odd about Matthias. He asked strange questions and paid attention to things that didn't matter. While other men discussed pelts and trading prices and the best locations for spring trapping, Matthias asked about why certain cabins stayed warmer than others. He wondered aloud why snow seemed to insulate the ground beneath it. He spent an entire evening at a trading post examining the construction of a farmer's haystack, asking detailed questions about compression and moisture resistance that made the farmer think he was simple-minded. The other trappers tolerated him because he was harmless and kept to himself, but they also kept their distance. Different was dangerous on the frontier, even when different was just peculiar. Matthias had partnered that season with Klaus Hoffmann, a German immigrant who had come west 4 years earlier. Klaus was practical and ambitious, interested primarily in collecting enough pelts to buy land and start a proper farm. He found Matthias's odd fixations amusing but irrelevant. They had established their camp in November of 1868 at a location that balanced competing priorities. Good trapping required proximity to water and beaver habitat. Survival required timber for cabin construction and firewood. Their chosen site sat near the confluence of 2 small creeks, surrounded by cottonwood and willow groves that provided adequate building materials. The cabin they built was typical of the region and era. They selected 28 logs, each roughly 10 inches in diameter, and notched them at corners, using the saddle notch technique that every frontier carpenter knew. The structure went up in 5 days, with both men working steadily. They chinked the gaps between logs with a mixture of prairie grass and mud. The door was simple planks hung on leather. Hinges. 1 small window covered with scraped hide let in dim light. The roof was cottonwood poles covered with bark and sod. The dirt floor was packed hard. It measured 12 feet by 14 feet inside, and it would keep out rain and break the wind. That was enough, or so they believed. By mid-December, they had the cabin stocked with supplies and their trap lines established across a 5-mile radius. The winter ahead looked promising. Both men were experienced enough to survive the cold months and optimistic enough to believe this season would be profitable. February of 1869 brought cold that felt like a physical force pressing against every living thing. The temperature dropped to 20 below zero and stayed there for 8 consecutive days. Inside the cabin, Matthias and Klaus burned firewood constantly. The stone fireplace they had built consumed entire logs every 2 hours. Despite the roaring fire, the interior temperature hovered barely above freezing. Frost formed on the interior walls where their breath condensed. Water in their bucket froze overnight, even though it sat 5 feet from the fireplace. They wore every piece of clothing they owned and still shivered under their blankets. On February 14th, Klaus left to check their eastern trap line. It was a routine trip he had made dozens of times, covering roughly 6 miles of creek bottom where they had set beaver traps. He left at dawn with his rifle, his trap bag, and a confident wave. Matthias stayed behind to process 3 pelts they had collected the previous day. The work kept him near the fire, scraping and stretching hides with numb fingers. Around midday, he noticed the temperature dropping further. The wind picked up, driving through gaps in the cabin walls that no amount of chinking seemed to seal. He added more wood to the fire and wondered if Klaus would cut his rounds short and return early. By late afternoon, Klaus had not returned. Matthias felt the first touch of real worry. The temperature was still falling. The wind was strengthening. He stepped outside and immediately understood the danger. The cold was not just uncomfortable now, it was lethal. Exposed skin hurt within seconds. Breathing was painful. This was killing cold, the kind that froze men in their tracks if they made mistakes. Matthias gathered his heaviest coat, wrapped his face in wool, grabbed his rifle, and headed east along Klaus's trapline route. He moved as quickly as the deep snow and brutal cold allowed, calling out periodically, listening for responses that never came. 3 miles from the cabin, he found Klaus sitting against a cottonwood tree beside the creek. His partner was dead. The story was written in the snow around him. Klaus had been checking a trap set near a beaver dam when he had apparently fallen through thin ice into knee-deep water. He had managed to pull himself out and had tried to make it back to the cabin. But wet clothes in 20 below temperatures were a death sentence. He had made it 3 miles before hypothermia had shut down his body. He had sat down to rest and never stood up again. Matthias stood over his partner's frozen body as the sun descended and the temperature continued its murderous fall. He could not carry Klaus back. The body was frozen solid, and the distance was too far. He marked the location carefully in his mind, knowing he would need to return when conditions improved. Then he turned and headed back to the cabin alone, moving through twilight cold that felt like it wanted to kill everything it touched. Matthias buried Klaus a week later when the temperature finally rose enough to make the journey possible. He piled stones over the grave to keep animals away and spent that night back in the cabin, unable to sleep. The death played through his mind in sequences he could not stop. Klaus falling through ice. Klaus walking while wet in lethal cold. Klaus sitting down against the tree. But what haunted Matthias most was not what happened out there on the trapline. It was what happened here in the cabin. They had burned through firewood at a catastrophic rate during those 8 days of extreme cold. They had consumed nearly half their winter supply, keeping the interior barely survivable. And it had not been enough. Even with constant fire, the cabin had been desperately cold. Matthias started thinking about heat differently. Most men thought about making more heat when they were cold. Bigger fires, more wood. Matthias began thinking about keeping heat instead of making it. He started paying attention to details other trappers ignored. When snow drifted against the cabin walls, those sections of interior wall were noticeably less cold than exposed sections. When he walked past haystacks at abandoned farmsteads, he noticed the hay near the bottom stayed dry even after heavy snow. Animals burrowed into hay piles for warmth. The thick compressed grass seemed to hold something the wind could not steal. Matthias began conducting crude experiments. He stuffed loose prairie grass into the gaps between logs, packing it as tightly as possible. Those sections of wall transmitted less cold. He hung a blanket across one corner of the cabin, creating a smaller space. That corner stayed warmer with less fire. He measured temperature using a simple thermometer he had purchased years earlier. The numbers told a story. Outside temperature 20 below. Inside temperature with roaring fire 32 degrees. The cabin was losing heat as fast as the fire could generate it. He calculated firewood consumption. During those 8 brutal days, they had burned roughly 4 cords of wood. Standard winter consumption for a trapping cabin was 6 to 8 cords for an entire season. They had used half that amount in 8 days. If cold that severe lasted longer, or returned multiple times, no amount of stockpiled firewood would be sufficient. The math was simple and terrifying. The cabin was not adequate for survival. Most mountain men would have accepted this reality as the cost of frontier life. Cold killed people. That was simply how things were. But Matthias became fixated on the problem in a way that went beyond rational concern. He started drawing diagrams on pieces of bark with charcoal. He sketched wall cross-sections showing heat flow. He made lists of materials and their properties. Spring arrived slowly across the Dakota Territory. By late March, the snow had melted enough for travel, and Matthias made a decision that would have seemed insane to any other trapper. Instead of immediately resuming his trap lines, he headed south toward the agricultural settlements along the Big Sioux River. He told no one where he was going or why. He simply locked his cabin, packed supplies for 2 weeks of travel, and left. The settlements were small clusters of immigrant farmers, primarily German and Scandinavian families, who had claimed land and were attempting to farm the prairie. Matthias had traded with them occasionally, exchanging pelts for flour and coffee. But this trip had a different purpose. He was not there to trade. He was there to study buildings. He spent 3 days at a settlement near what would later become Watertown. He walked around farmsteads examining barns, livestock shelters, and storage buildings. He asked questions that farmers found peculiar. How thick were the walls? What materials held heat best? How did they keep animals warm in winter? The farmers tolerated his strange inquiries because he was polite and clearly serious, even if his purpose remained unclear. On the 4th day, Matthias found what he was looking for. A farmer named Friedrich Weber was stacking hay bales in a 3-sided shelter for his cattle. The bales were rectangular, tightly compressed by a horse-powered baler, each one measuring roughly 18 inches by 14 inches by 36 inches. Weber explained that loose hay was bulky and inefficient for storage. Compressed bales were dense, stackable, and shed water if properly stored. The cattle could shelter behind stacked walls of hay bales during winter storms, protected from wind. Matthias examined the bales with intense focus. He lifted one, surprised by the weight. Roughly 60 pounds of compressed prairie grass. He pressed against it, noting the density. He asked Weber how they held up to moisture. Weber showed him bales that had been stacked for 2 years. The outer surface showed some weathering, but the interior remained dry and intact. The compression kept moisture from penetrating. That night, Matthias sat in Weber's barn with paper and pencil borrowed from the farmer's wife. He did calculations by lamplight. A hay bale measured 18 inches thick. 3 bales stacked side by side created a wall 54 inches deep. Compressed grass was insulation. Air pockets trapped between grass stems resisted heat transfer. A wall made of stacked hay bales would be 3 times thicker than a log wall and composed entirely of insulating material. The idea was absurd. Hay was animal feed. It was agricultural waste. It was flammable. But the mathematics were undeniable. Matthias returned to the James River region in mid-April of 1869 with a plan that sounded like madness when spoken aloud. He would build a cabin from hay bales. Not a barn or livestock shelter, but a human dwelling designed to survive Dakota winters. He knew how the idea would be received, but the mathematics gave him confidence that other men's laughter could not shake. He had seen Klaus freeze to death 3 miles from a cabin with a roaring fire. That memory eliminated any concern about looking foolish. His first stop was Johann Krebs's trading post, a rough log structure that served trappers and settlers within a 30-mile radius. Krebs was a practical businessman who stocked what people needed and avoided what they did not. Matthias's supply list made him suspicious. Heavy gauge wire in 100-foot rolls, pre-made wooden window frames with glass panes, a sheet metal chimney pipe in sections, tar paper in rolls, hemp rope. These were not trapper supplies. Krebs asked what Matthias was building. Matthias explained simply that he was constructing a cabin using hay bales for walls. Krebs stared at him for a long moment, then laughed. The laugh started as a chuckle and built into genuine amusement. Other men in the trading post heard the explanation and joined the laughter. Dieter Zimmerman, a trapper who worked territory adjacent to Matthias's, slapped the counter and declared that Brenner had finally lost his mind completely. The joke started immediately. Brenner was building a barn for himself. Brenner was going to live like livestock. The first rain would turn his cabin into a pile of moldy straw. Did he plan to eat his walls when food ran low? Matthias listened without response, paid for his supplies, and arranged for delivery to his camp. Krebs took his money, but made a public bet with Zimmerman that the structure would not survive its first significant rain. The odds were 3-1 against Matthias. Word spread through the scattered trapping community with remarkable speed. The story was too absurd not to repeat. Matthias Brenner, the odd trapper who asked strange questions, was building a cabin from hay bales. Men who had never met him heard the story and formed opinions. Some thought he was genuinely insane. Others assumed he was conducting some kind of experiment that would fail expensively. A few wondered if there was something to the idea, but they kept those thoughts private. Matthias spent the next 2 weeks purchasing hay bales from Friedrich Weber and other farmers along the Big Sioux River. He paid cash for 240 bales, a transaction that further convinced people of his insanity. Hay was cheap, but buying that quantity for construction rather than livestock feed seemed like throwing money into a fire. He arranged wagon transport to his campsite, paying teamsters extra to haul agricultural products into trapping territory. The teamsters thought he was crazy but appreciated the unusual business. By early May, Matthias had all his materials assembled at his chosen construction site. The hay bales were stacked under canvas tarps. The wire, window frames, chimney pipe, and tar paper were organized near where the cabin would rise. He had Klaus's tools and his own determination. The mockery from other trappers had become background noise he no longer noticed. He was ready to build something the frontier had never seen before. Matthias chose a new location for his cabin, abandoning the site where he and Klaus had built their inadequate log structure. The new spot sat on higher ground roughly 40 yards from the creek, elevated enough to avoid spring flooding, but close enough for convenient water access. The location provided clear sight lines in 3 directions and had good southern exposure for winter sun. Most importantly, the ground was level and well drained. He started with a foundation, something virtually no trapper bothered with. Standard practice was to set logs directly on the ground and accept the inevitable settling and rot. Matthias dug a shallow trench outlining a rectangle 16 feet by 20 feet. He filled the trench with rocks gathered from the creek bed, creating a level perimeter foundation that would keep the bottom course of hay bales off direct ground contact. The rock foundation took 3 days to complete properly. Next came a wooden platform. He cut and shaped cottonwood logs into rough planks using a 2-man saw operated alone through sheer, stubborn effort. The planks were laid across the rock foundation, creating a raised wooden floor 6 inches above ground level. He secured the planks with wooden pegs and sealed the gaps with tar paper. The platform would keep moisture from wicking up into the hay bale walls and would provide a solid base for the unusual structure he was about to build. On May 15th, Matthias began stacking hay bales. He started at one corner, placing 3 bales side by side to create the first course of the wall. Each bale was positioned with the cut ends facing outward, showing the compressed grass cross-section. He used his heavy gauge wire to bind bales together, threading the wire through the bales using a sharpened steel rod as a needle. The wire emerged from the top of each bale, allowing him to secure the next course above. The bales were stacked in a running bond pattern, identical to brick masonry. Each bale in the second course spanned the joint between 2 bales below, creating interlocking strength. At the corners, he alternated the orientation so bales from perpendicular walls interlocked. The corner construction was critical. This was where most hay bale structures would fail if they failed at all. Dieter Zimmerman rode past on the second day of construction. He stopped his horse and stared at the rising hay bale walls with open disbelief. He called out, asking if Matthias was building a giant bird nest. Matthias ignored him and continued working. Zimmerman sat on his horse for 10 minutes, watching, then rode away, shaking his head. That evening at Krebs's trading post, Zimmerman described what he had seen. The cabin looked exactly like a barn built for livestock, except smaller, and with a human being apparently planning to live inside it. Other trappers made excuses to ride past Matthias's construction site over the following weeks. The hay bale cabin became a spectacle, a source of entertainment in a region where entertainment was scarce. Men brought friends to see the lunatic building. Some offered sarcastic advice. Most just laughed and rode on. The walls rose slowly through late May and into June. Matthias worked alone, lifting 60-pound bales into position, wiring them securely, checking alignment constantly. Each course required careful attention. The bales needed to be level and plumb, maintaining vertical walls despite the irregular nature of compressed agricultural products. He used a simple plumb line and a level he had constructed from a straight board and a weighted string. The wall thickness was remarkable. Each wall was 3 bales deep, creating a total thickness of 54 inches from interior to exterior surface. A standard log cabin wall was roughly 10 to 12 inches thick, depending on log diameter. Matthias's hay bale walls were more than 4 times thicker. The comparison seemed absurd when other trappers pointed it out, but Matthias understood what they did not. Thickness was not the point. Insulation was the point. Compressed hay created millions of tiny air pockets between grass stems. Air was one of nature's best insulators when trapped and prevented from circulating. The 54-inch thick walls were essentially 54 inches of trapped air pockets wrapped in grass structure. Heat trying to escape from inside would have to travel through this massive barrier of non-conductive material. Cold trying to enter from outside faced the same obstacle. Matthias had done calculations during the spring. A log wall conducted heat readily. Wood was dense and conducted thermal energy through its structure. You could feel this yourself by touching the interior wall of a log cabin during winter. The wall was cold because heat was moving through it constantly. Matthias's hay bale walls would be different. The interior surface would stay close to room temperature because heat could not escape through the insulating barrier. The wire binding system was essential. Each bale was secured to the bales around it and to the courses above and below. The wire prevented bales from shifting or compressing unevenly. He used 3 strands of wire per bale, creating a network of reinforcement throughout the structure. The wire also allowed him to tighten the bales periodically as settling occurred, maintaining structural integrity. At the corners, the perpendicular stacking created natural interlocking. He reinforced these critical points with additional wire running diagonally through multiple bales, binding the corner bales together in a 3-dimensional matrix. The corners would bear the weight of the roof and resist lateral forces from wind. They needed to be stronger than the rest of the wall. By the end of June, the walls were 7 courses high, reaching roughly 8 feet above the platform floor. Matthias left openings for a door and 2 small windows. These openings were the most complex parts of the construction, requiring wooden frames strong enough to bear the weight of bales above while maintaining the structural integrity of the walls. He would address those challenges next, but first, the basic walls needed completion. The window openings presented engineering challenges Matthias had anticipated, but not fully understood until construction reached that stage. A standard log cabin window was straightforward. You selected the wall location, cut through 1 or 2 logs, inserted a wooden frame, and secured it with pegs or nails. The logs above the opening rested on the frame, transferring their weight downward through the structure, simple and reliable. Hay bales were not logs. They were compressible, irregular, and stacked rather than interlocked. Creating an opening meant interrupting the running bond pattern and somehow transferring the weight of upper courses around the gap. If done incorrectly, the wall would sag, compress unevenly, or potentially collapse. Matthias needed windows for light and ventilation, but they could not compromise structural integrity. He designed wooden frames that would function as load-bearing elements within the hay bale walls. Each frame was constructed from 4-inch by 4-inch cottonwood timbers, carefully squared and joined at corners using mortise and tenon joinery. The frames were substantially overbuilt by normal window standards, but they needed to support significant weight. He made 2 frames, each measuring 14 inches wide by 18 inches tall, sized to fit precisely within the hay bale wall thickness. The installation process required cutting through already stacked bales, something Matthias had worried would destabilize the walls. He developed a technique using a long knife heated in his fire. The hot blade cut through compressed hay cleanly, and he removed hay in rectangular sections slightly larger than his window frames. The gaps created were ragged but adequately sized. He inserted the wooden frames into these gaps, positioning them carefully so the interior face sat flush with the interior wall surface. The frames extended through the full 54-inch wall thickness, creating a tunnel through the insulation. He secured each frame using his wire system, threading wire through holes drilled in the frame corners and connecting to the wire network binding the bales together. Additional wire wrapped around the frames and through surrounding bales created a web of reinforcement. Once the frames were secured, Matthias filled gaps between frame and hay with his clay mixture, the same formula he had developed for chinking. The mixture sealed air leaks and provided additional structural bonding. He then continued stacking bales above the window openings. The weight of upper courses transferred through the wooden frames rather than through missing bales, maintaining wall integrity. The windows themselves were simple. He had purchased small glass panes and wooden sashes from the trading post. These fit into the wooden frames on the interior side, held in place with small wooden stops. He built exterior shutters from thick planks, hinged to open inward, providing protection and insulation when closed. With shutters closed, the window openings became simply insulated tunnels through the wall. With shutters open and glass in place, they admitted light while maintaining most of the wall's insulating properties. Dieter Zimmermann visited again in early July and examined the window installation with grudging interest. He asked how Matthias expected glass to survive in hay walls. Would not the hay compress and break the glass? Matthias explained that the wooden frames prevented compression and bore the structural loads. Zimmermann shook his head, still skeptical, but his mockery had shifted slightly. The cabin was becoming real despite its absurdity. The door opening was a more significant structural challenge than the windows. A door needed to be large enough for a man to pass through easily, roughly 36 inches wide and 72 inches tall. That opening would interrupt nearly half the wall's width and most of its height. The weight of bales above needed to transfer around this large gap without causing sagging or failure. Matthias began by building a robust door frame from 6-inch by 6-inch timbers. The frame was rectangular, with vertical side posts and a horizontal header beam across the top. He joined the corners using through tenons, long tenon extensions that passed completely through the mortises and were secured with wooden pegs driven from the exterior. The joints were immensely strong, capable of bearing substantial loads without movement. The frame sat on the wooden platform floor, anchored with long wooden pegs driven through the frame's bottom member and into the platform planks below. This anchoring was critical. The frame needed to be absolutely rigid, incapable of shifting under the weight it would bear. He tested the frame by having it support his full body weight hanging from the header beam. The frame did not move. He positioned the frame in the wall opening he had left during bale stacking, centering it carefully. The frame extended through the full wall thickness, just like the window frames, but much larger. He secured it using his wire binding system, but with additional reinforcement. He drilled holes through the vertical frame posts at multiple heights and threaded wire through these holes, then through surrounding bales, creating a network that tied the frame directly to the hay bale structure. Above the door opening, he installed a lintel beam across the gap between walls. This beam was a solid cottonwood log, roughly 8 inches in diameter, resting on the door frame's header and extending 12 inches into the hay bale walls on each side. The lintel would catch the weight of upper bale courses and transfer that weight laterally into the walls rather than down through the door opening. He continued stacking bales above the lintel, maintaining the running bond pattern. The bales above the door were wired to the lintel and to each other, creating a cohesive structure. The weight transferred around the opening as intended. He could see no sagging or compression different from the rest of the wall. The door itself required substantial construction. He used thick planks hewn from cottonwood, each plank 3 inches thick. He fitted them together using tongue and groove joints, creating a door that was effectively a solid piece of wood 40 inches wide and 76 inches tall. The door was heavy, roughly 80 pounds, but the weight contributed to its sealing properties. He mounted the door using 3 heavy iron hinges purchased from Krebs. The hinges were bolted through both door and frame, creating connections that could not pull free. The door swung smoothly despite its weight. He built a simple bar lock on the interior, a heavy wooden beam that dropped into iron brackets mounted to the frame, securing the door against forced entry or wind pressure. The exterior threshold required careful attention. He built a small covered porch structure extending 3 feet from the door with a sloped roof to shed rain and snow away from the opening. The roof construction began in late July, after the walls reached their final height of 9 courses, creating interior ceiling height of roughly 8 feet. Matthias had learned from his experience with the previous cabin that roof design mattered as much as walls. A roof that leaked or shed heat rapidly undermined whatever protection the walls provided. His hay bale walls would be meaningless if the roof was inadequate. He started by laying massive ridge beams across the width of the structure, resting on the top course of bales. These beams were cottonwood logs, roughly 10 inches in diameter, shaped flat on the bottom surface where they contacted bales. He positioned them 20 inches apart, running parallel across the 20-foot width of the cabin. The beams extended 12 inches beyond the walls on each side, creating substantial overhang. This overhang was critical for hay bale construction. The bales needed protection from direct rain and snow. Water running down walls would eventually compromise the compressed hay. The overhang would shed precipitation away from the walls, keeping the hay dry. Matthias made the overhang even more pronounced at the eaves, extending them 18 inches beyond the wall face. Across the ridge beams, he laid split planks hewn flat on one side. These planks ran perpendicular to the ridge beams, covering the entire roof area. He overlapped them like shingles, each course covering the gaps in the course below. Every plank was secured to the ridge beams with wooden pegs driven through pre-drilled holes. The result was a solid wooden deck that would support whatever additional layers he added above. Over the planks, he laid his tar paper, overlapping sheets and sealing seams with pine resin he had collected and boiled down. The tar paper provided waterproofing, creating a continuous moisture barrier. He worked carefully, ensuring no gaps or tears existed in this critical layer. Water penetration through the roof would defeat his entire design. Above the tar paper, he added a layer of birch bark he had harvested and dried. Birch bark was naturally waterproof and would provide backup protection if the tar paper failed. The bark pieces overlapped like roof shingles, creating a second water-resistant layer. He secured the bark with wooden laths nailed across the roof, holding everything in position. Finally, he added sod. He cut thick sections of prairie sod, grass side up, and laid them across the entire roof surface. The living grass would root into the bark and create a living roof that insulated against temperature extremes while adding substantial weight to stabilize the structure. The sod was heavy, adding roughly 40 pounds per square foot to the roof load, but the ridge beams and hay bale walls supported the weight without difficulty. The completed roof had multiple protective layers: wooden deck, tar paper, birch bark, and living sod. Water would need to penetrate 4 different barriers to reach the interior. Heat would need to escape through substantial insulation. The roof would shed snow, while the sod layer provided thermal mass. The cabin was completed in early August of 1869. Matthias stood outside on a warm summer evening and examined what he had built over 3 months of solitary work. The structure looked unlike anything else in the territory. The hay bale walls showed their golden, compressed straw surface texture. The thatched sod roof sprouted green grass. The small windows with their wooden shutters looked almost conventional, but the massive wall thickness around them betrayed the building's unusual nature. He moved his supplies inside and began the process of making the space functional. He built a sleeping platform along one wall, raised 18 inches off the floor. He constructed shelves for food stores and equipment. Most importantly, he built a fireplace in the northwest corner using stones gathered from the creek bed. The fireplace was small compared to what he and Klaus had used in their log cabin. He made it deliberately modest, anticipating that the hay bale walls would require far less heating. The chimney was sheet metal pipe extending through the roof, sealed carefully where it penetrated the multiple roof layers. He built a stone smoke shelf inside the fireplace to reflect heat into the room and prevent downdrafts. The entire fireplace construction took a week, but when finished, it drew properly and radiated heat efficiently. Summer gave way to early fall. Matthias resumed trapping, running lines similar to those he had worked with Klaus. The work was solitary now, and he often returned to the cabin thinking about his dead partner. But the cabin itself provided comfort that went beyond shelter. It felt solid and secure in ways the previous structure never had. The first test came in late September, when a 3-day rainstorm moved through the region. Rain fell steadily, driven by wind that found every weakness in standard construction. Matthias stayed inside and watched. Water ran off his sod roof and dripped from the generous eaves, falling well away from the hay bale walls. No water penetrated the walls, no leaks appeared in the roof. The interior remained completely dry, while outside the world was saturated. He began taking temperature measurements systematically. He had his simple thermometer and used it to record interior and exterior temperatures at the same time each day. The data showed patterns that confirmed his theories. When exterior temperature was 60 degrees, interior temperature was 62 degrees with no fire. When exterior temperature dropped to 40 degrees at night, interior temperature only fell to 54 degrees. The cabin was holding heat that had accumulated during the day, releasing it slowly at night. As October brought cooler weather, the pattern became more pronounced. He lit his small fireplace in the evenings, burning modest amounts of wood. The interior warmed quickly and stayed warm long after the fire burned down to coals. He estimated he was using 1/5 the firewood he and Klaus had burned in the log cabin during similar weather. Dieter Zimmerman stopped by in mid-October, ostensibly to discuss trapline territories, but clearly curious about the hay bale cabin. Matthias invited him inside. Zimmerman stood in the center of the room, looking around with an expression that mixed skepticism and surprise. November of 1869 arrived with temperatures that reminded everyone winter was not a season to take lightly. The first significant cold snap came on November 8th, dropping temperatures to 5 below zero overnight. Matthias woke in his hay bale cabin and immediately noticed something remarkable. Despite letting his fire burn out completely during the night, the interior temperature was still comfortable enough that his water bucket had not frozen. He lit a small fire and took measurements. Exterior temperature 5 below zero. Interior temperature 41 degrees with no fire burning for 8 hours. As the small fire warmed the space, interior temperature rose to 65 degrees within an hour. He added this data to his growing record of observations. The hay bale walls were performing better than his most optimistic calculations had predicted. That same morning, Dieter Zimmerman was splitting frozen firewood outside his log cabin 3 miles away. He had burned through an entire night's worth of wood, keeping his cabin barely habitable. His water bucket was frozen solid. Ice had formed on the interior walls, where moisture had condensed and frozen. He was facing the reality that his winter firewood supply might not be adequate if the cold persisted. Other trappers in the region were having similar experiences. Johann Krebs, at his trading post, heard multiple reports of cabins struggling to maintain warmth despite constant fires. The cold snap was testing every structure in the territory, and many were failing the test. Men who had survived previous winters were burning through firewood at alarming rates. By mid-November, word had spread that Matthias Brenner's hay bale cabin was staying warm with minimal fires. The information spread slowly through the scattered trapping community, passed along when men met at the trading post or crossed paths on trap lines. The mockery that had characterized earlier reactions began shifting to curiosity. Several trappers made excuses to visit Matthias, wanting to see the cabin during cold weather. Wilhelm Schaefer stopped by on November 19th. Schaefer was an established trapper with a wife and 3 children living in a log cabin 10 miles south. He had heard stories about the hay bale cabin and wanted to see it himself. Matthias welcomed him, and Schaefer spent an hour examining the construction and asking detailed questions. How thick were the walls? How was the door sealed? What was the chimney configuration? Schaefer was direct about his concern. His cabin was adequate during moderate winters, but if this winter brought sustained severe cold, he worried about keeping his family safe. He had 4 cords of firewood stockpiled, which should have been sufficient. But if he needed to burn constantly at maximum rate, 4 cords would last perhaps 6 weeks. What happened after that? Matthias showed him the temperature data he had been recording. The numbers were undeniable. The hay bale cabin maintained interior warmth, with a fraction of the fuel a log cabin required. December brought steadily falling temperatures and increasingly frequent snow. The winter of 1869-70 was developing into something severe. Old-timers at Krebs's trading post compared it to the winter of 1857, which had killed livestock and people across the territory. The temperature dropped below zero and stayed there for days at a time. Snow accumulated in drifts that blocked trails and made travel difficult. Matthias continued his routine of checking trap lines and recording temperature data. His hay bale cabin remained comfortable with minimal heating. He burned perhaps 3 hours of fire per day, letting coals die overnight. Each morning he woke to an interior temperature in the mid-40s, comfortable enough to dress without urgency. A small fire brought the space to 65 degrees within an hour. His firewood consumption was remarkably low. He estimated he was using roughly half a cord per month. At that rate, his stockpiled 3 cords would last the entire winter with surplus remaining. The hay bale walls were proving their worth with mathematical precision. Other trappers were not faring as well. Dieter Zimmerman visited on December 23rd, looking exhausted. He admitted his firewood situation was becoming critical. He had burned through 3 of his 4 stockpiled cords, and winter was only half finished. He faced the choice of abandoning his cabin to travel to settlements for more wood, or rationing his remaining supply and accepting a dangerously cold interior. Matthias offered to help him cut additional wood, and they spent 2 days working together in the sparse timber along the creek. The work was brutal in sub-zero temperatures, but they managed to gather another cord. Zimmerman openly acknowledged that Matthias's cabin design was no longer funny. It was proving to be genuinely superior. On December 28th, Wilhelm Schaefer appeared at Matthias's door with news that spread quickly through the region. A trapper named Carl Becker had been found dead in his cabin 15 miles north. Becker had apparently run out of firewood during a particularly cold night. His fire had gone out, and the temperature inside his cabin had dropped to lethal levels. He had frozen to death in his bed. The news shocked the trapping community. Becker had been experienced and competent. His death was not the result of stupidity or carelessness. It was the result of a cabin that could not maintain life-sustaining warmth without constant fire, and a winter that was colder than anticipated. Men began calculating their own firewood supplies with new urgency. How many more weeks would their stockpiles last? What happened when the wood ran out? Matthias said nothing, but he knew his hay bale cabin had already proven its central premise. In a winter that was killing people, his unusual structure was keeping him comfortable and safe. January 7, 1870, began with an unnatural stillness. The air felt heavy and cold in a way that signaled something worse approaching. Matthias stepped outside his hay bale cabin at dawn and studied the sky. Heavy gray clouds moved from the northwest, and the temperature was already 15 below zero. He recognized the signs. A major storm was coming, possibly the worst of the winter. By midday, the wind arrived. It started as a steady push from the north, then strengthened into sustained gusts that drove snow horizontally across the prairie. Visibility dropped to nearly zero. The temperature continued falling. Matthias checked his thermometer at 2 in the afternoon, 28 below zero, and still dropping. The wind made it feel far colder. He secured his door, closed his window shutters, and lit a fire. The cabin's interior remained remarkably calm and quiet, despite the howling wind outside. The thick hay bale walls blocked sound as effectively as they blocked cold. He could hear the storm, but it sounded distant and muted, as though happening in another world. By evening, the temperature had dropped to 35 below zero. The blizzard was in full force, with wind gusts that would kill any living thing caught outside within minutes. Matthias maintained his small fire and took temperature readings. Exterior temperature 35 below. Interior temperature 62 degrees. He was burning wood at his normal modest rate. The hay bale walls were doing exactly what he had designed them to do. 3 miles away, Wilhelm Schaefer was fighting for his family's survival. His log cabin had a fire burning at maximum intensity, consuming wood as fast as he could feed it. Despite the roaring flames, the interior temperature was dropping steadily. The brutal wind found every gap between logs, every imperfection in the chinking. Cold air poured in while warm air escaped. The cabin was losing the battle. Schaefer's 3 children huddled near the fire, wrapped in every blanket the family owned. His wife, Anna, kept the youngest child inside her coat, sharing body heat. The temperature inside the cabin had dropped to 20 degrees despite the massive fire. Ice was forming on the interior walls. Water in their bucket was frozen solid. Schaefer made calculations that terrified him. They were burning through firewood at a catastrophic rate. At this consumption level, their remaining supply would last perhaps 8 more hours. After that, they would have no fuel. In a cabin that could not hold heat, no fuel meant death. The blizzard showed no signs of weakening, and traveling to gather more wood was impossible in current conditions. Other families in scattered cabins across the territory were facing similar mathematics. Fires burning constantly, temperatures inside barely survivable, firewood supplies diminishing. The blizzard that had seemed like just another winter storm was revealing itself as something far more dangerous. It was a test that standard frontier cabins were failing, and people were beginning to realize that survival might require desperate measures. By midnight on January 7th, Wilhelm Schaefer knew his cabin could not protect his family through the night. The temperature outside had reached 40 below zero. Inside, despite burning their last reserves of firewood in a roaring fire, the interior temperature had dropped to 18 degrees. His youngest child, a daughter of 4 years named Emma, was showing signs of hypothermia. Her skin was pale, her movement sluggish, her speech confused. Anna wrapped Emma in every piece of fabric they owned, but fabric without heat was inadequate. The little girl needed warmth that the failing cabin could not provide. Schaefer faced an impossible choice: stay in the cabin and watch his family freeze, or venture into a blizzard that would kill them within minutes of exposure. Neither option offered survival. Then he remembered Matthias Brenner's hay bale cabin, the strange structure everyone had mocked. Schaefer recalled his November visit, seeing the cabin's comfortable interior during cold weather. He remembered Matthias explaining the insulation properties, showing his temperature records. At the time, Schaefer had been interested, but not convinced. Now that odd cabin represented the only possibility of survival. The distance was 3 miles. In normal conditions, an easy hour's walk. In 40 below temperatures with blizzard winds, it would be a nightmare journey, but staying meant certain death. Schaefer made his decision. They would attempt to reach Brenner's cabin. He wrapped his children in blankets and furs. Anna carried Emma inside her coat. Schaefer took his rifle and a length of rope. They would tie themselves together to avoid separation in the whiteout conditions. They left their cabin at 1 in the morning. The cold hit them like a physical blow. Schaefer led, breaking trail through thigh-deep snow, following a creek he knew would guide them toward Brenner's location. The wind drove ice crystals into any exposed skin. Breathing was painful. The children cried but kept moving. Anna urged them forward, carrying Emma, who had stopped crying and gone silent. The journey took nearly 3 hours. Schaefer navigated by memory and desperate hope, unable to see more than a few feet ahead. Several times he considered turning back, but he knew their cabin offered no salvation. They stumbled forward through darkness and howling wind, fighting cold that wanted to kill them. At 3:45 in the morning, Schaefer saw a dim shape ahead, the hay bale cabin barely visible through blowing snow. He pounded on the door with numb fists, shouting Matthias's name. Inside, Matthias woke from sleep, hearing the desperate knocking. He opened the door and found the Schaefer family on his threshold, covered in snow and ice, barely conscious. Matthias pulled them inside. The warmth of the cabin hit them immediately. Wilhelm collapsed just inside the door. Anna stumbled to the fire with Emma. The children stood shaking violently as their bodies recognized they were no longer dying. Matthias closed the door against the storm and began the process of saving 5 lives his hay bale walls had already protected. The contrast was immediate and undeniable. Outside, the temperature was 40 below zero, with wind that would freeze exposed flesh in minutes. Inside the hay bale cabin, the temperature was 58 degrees, with a fire that had burned down to coals during Matthias's sleep. The Schaefer family stood shaking near the fireplace, their bodies struggling to process the transition from lethal cold to survivable warmth. Matthias added wood to revive the fire and moved the family closer to the heat. He checked each person for frostbite, finding superficial damage on Wilhelm's hands and face, but nothing severe. Emma, the youngest child, was dangerously hypothermic. Her core temperature had dropped to critical levels. Matthias wrapped her in dry blankets near the fire and prepared warm broth from his supplies. Anna Schaefer sat holding Emma, tears running down her face, unable to speak. Her other children huddled together, gradually stopping their shaking as warmth penetrated their bodies. Wilhelm sat against the hay bale wall, staring at nothing, processing how close they had come to dying. As dawn approached, the blizzard continued its assault outside. Inside the hay bale cabin, Matthias maintained his small fire and explained to Wilhelm what they were experiencing. The walls were 54 inches of compressed hay. Each inch was filled with trapped air that blocked heat transfer. Cold could not penetrate inward. Heat could not escape outward. The cabin was essentially a thermal fortress. Wilhelm asked about firewood consumption. Matthias showed him the modest pile he had been burning. In one night of this extreme storm, Matthias had burned perhaps 1/8 of a cord. Wilhelm had burned nearly half a cord in his log cabin during the same period, and it had not been enough. The mathematical difference was staggering and life-saving. By mid-morning on January 8th, other families began arriving. Dieter Zimmermann appeared with his wife and 2 children, having abandoned their cabin when their fire could no longer maintain survivable temperatures. A trapper named Otto Klein arrived alone, his cabin 3 miles east having become uninhabitable. By noon, 11 people were sheltering in Matthias's 16 by 20-foot hay bale cabin. The space was crowded but warm. Matthias maintained his fire at a modest level, and the interior temperature stayed comfortable. He rationed his food supplies among the refugees, and everyone understood they might be trapped for days until the blizzard passed. But they were alive, and that was what mattered. The storm continued through January 8th and into January 9th. For 48 hours, the temperature outside never rose above 35 below zero. Wind howled constantly. Snow accumulated to depths that made travel impossible, and inside the hay bale cabin that everyone had mocked, 11 people survived in relative comfort, while the frontier's worst blizzard in decades raged outside walls made of animal feed. The blizzard finally broke on January 10th. The wind died, the snow stopped, and the temperature began a slow climb back toward survivable levels. The people sheltering in Matthias's hay bale cabin emerged into a transformed landscape. Snow had drifted to heights of 8 and 10 feet in places. The world was white and silent and devastatingly cold, but the immediate crisis had passed. Wilhelm Schaefer and the others returned to their cabins to assess damage and salvage what remained. Several structures had suffered badly during the storm. Roofs had collapsed under snow weight. Doors had been torn loose by wind. Interiors were filled with drifted snow. The cabins that remained structurally sound were still inadequate for habitation. Without constant massive fires, they could not maintain life-sustaining temperatures, and the winter was far from over. Word spread quickly through the scattered community about what had happened. 9 people had died in the territory during the blizzard. Some had frozen in their cabins when firewood ran out. Others had attempted to travel and died of exposure. The mortality toll was the highest anyone could remember for a single storm event, and 11 people had survived specifically because they had taken shelter in a cabin made of hay bales. The story changed attitudes immediately. What had been a source of mockery became a subject of intense practical interest. Trappers and settlers who had laughed at Matthias's construction now asked serious questions about techniques and materials. How were the bales stacked? How were corners reinforced? What protected the hay from moisture? Could similar structures be built before the next major storm? Matthias spent the following weeks teaching anyone who wanted to learn. He walked through his cabin with small groups, explaining each element of construction. He showed the wire binding system, the wooden frames around openings, the multi-layer roof, and the foundation that kept the bottom course dry. He provided measurements and material lists. He emphasized that the technique was not complicated, just different from what people knew. Wilhelm Schaefer was the first to begin construction of his own hay bale cabin. He traveled to farming settlements and purchased bales. He bought wire and window frames. He returned to his land and started building in late January while his family continued living in their damaged log cabin. The new structure went up slowly, following Matthias's instructions precisely. Schaefer understood better than anyone that this was not an experiment or curiosity. It was survival infrastructure. By early February, 3 more hay bale cabins were under construction in the territory. Dieter Zimmermann built one. Otto Klein began another. A settler family named Hoffman started a larger version designed for their 6 children. The building technique spread through practical demonstration rather than promotion. People built hay bale cabins because they had experienced or witnessed the failure of standard construction during extreme conditions. Johann Krebs at the trading post began stocking materials specifically for hay bale construction. Wire sales increased dramatically. Window frame orders multiplied. Krebs, who had bet against Matthias's cabin surviving its first rain, now profited from supplying materials for structures built on Matthias's model. The irony was not lost on anyone, but Krebs was a businessman and recognized market demand when he saw it. Matthias Brenner continued trapping through the winter of 1869–70, and for 4 more winters after that. He lived in his hay bale cabin and maintained his trap lines, a solitary figure in a harsh landscape. His cabin remained warm and dry through storms that destroyed other structures. The hay bale walls never failed. The roof never leaked. The design he had conceived in grief and desperation proved itself season after season. By 1875, approximately 30 hay bale cabins existed in the Dakota Territory and neighboring regions. The technique had spread through the practical frontier communication network of trappers, traders, and settlers, sharing information that kept people alive. Variations developed based on available materials and local conditions. Some builders used 3 bale-thick walls. Others used 2 bale-thick walls in milder climates. Some incorporated stone foundations. Others used wooden platforms like Matthias's original, but all followed the core principle. Compressed hay provided insulation that logs could not match. The innovation saved lives in ways that were documented and in ways that went unrecorded. During the severe winter of 1876–77, families in hay bale cabins survived conditions that killed people in log structures. During prairie fires that swept through settlements, hay bale cabins with their sod roofs resisted ignition better than wooden structures. The practical advantages extended beyond winter, heating into multiple aspects of frontier survival. Matthias left the trapping life in 1876. The fur trade had collapsed completely, and the frontier was changing. He traveled west to Montana Territory and worked as a carpenter in mining camps, building structures for wages. He married in 1879, a widow named Sarah Cummings, who had 2 children from her first marriage. They settled on a small ranch near Helena and raised horses. Matthias built their home using hay bale construction naturally, and it stood solid through Montana winters that tested everything. He lived quietly for the next 17 years. His life after trapping was unremarkable by frontier standards. He worked, raised a family, and avoided attention. He never promoted his cabin design or sought recognition. When people asked about the hay bale technique, he shared information freely, as he always had, but he made no claims to invention or special genius. Matthias died on March 12, 1893, at age 56. A horse had kicked him in the chest while he worked in his corral. The injury was severe, and he died 3 days later, surrounded by his family. He was buried in a small cemetery outside Helena. His gravestone listed his name, birth, and death dates, and nothing more. Sarah remained in the hay bale house until her own death in 1903. The structure was still solid, still warm, still functional after 34 years. New owners occupied it for another 20 years before it was finally abandoned when the property was sold to a larger ranch operation. Modern architectural historians studying vernacular frontier construction discovered references to hay bale cabins in Dakota and Montana territories during the 1870s and 80s.